Hey man, how's it going? Good to see you. I'm all right. Just busy, you know. Yeah, settling in. Yep. No, please go ahead.
Do you want to say something? Go ahead.
Oh, hi.
I'm Tommy Schultz.
Oh, nice to meet
I'm
you.
now serving until they can find someone more adequate.
Oh, please. Come
Serving
on.
as chair. But it's
Okay,
a pleasure
come
to
on
meet you.
now.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Hello. And welcome to today's colloquium. Regretfully, Professor Gates is unable to attend, but I'm sure he'll watch the video later. Before we start, let me just say that next week's colloquium will be delivered by Peter Hume, and he'll be speaking on Wilfred A. Domingo, one of the chief troublemakers among the Negroes. So please welcome to the podium Professor William Julius Wilson, Professor of Sociology here at Harvard.
So I'm very pleased to present Ellis Monk at today's colloquium. I was first introduced to Ellis in 2008 by his mentor and dissertation advisor, Loic Quant. And it was at Loic's house in Berkeley the evening that Barack Obama won the election. And we were celebrating big time. I have followed his professional career fairly closely since then, including reading carefully several award-winning essays related to his dissertation research. I met him again and heard a paper he presented at a conference sponsored by the Black Doctoral Network in Philadelphia in 2012. And my verbal and written interactions with him have been so intellectually stimulating that I readily agreed when he asked me to serve as a reference. Ellis Monk is a brilliant and creative student of sociology who has been involved in what I consider to be cutting-edge research, cutting-edge cross-cultural research on social categories and social inequality. He recently joined the Harvard faculty as assistant professor of sociology. He previously taught at the University of Chicago and Princeton University shortly after receiving his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. His teaching and scholarship interests are centered on the comparative examination of social inequality, especially with respect to race and ethnicity. Ellis uses both quantitative and qualitative methods to investigate the complex relationships between social categories and social inequality, and encompasses such areas as social demography, health, aging, social psychology, sociology of the body, political sociology, as well as historical sociology. His articles have been published in the American Journal of Sociology. Sorry about that. His articles have been published in the American Journal of Sociology, Social Forces, and Social Problems, among other journals. And he is also at work on a series of empirical and theoretical articles that address different dimensions of skin tone stratification, health, bodily capital, and the measurement of social categories and inequality. And I look forward to his piece, The Color of Punishment, African American Skin Tone and the Criminal Justice System, that will soon be published in the forthcoming in Ethnic and Racial Studies. And I'm eager to read his forthcoming book, tentatively entitled Tracing the Color Line, Race, Bodily Capital, and Inequality in the US and Brazil, which is under contract with the University of Chicago Press. Now, in addition to the awards related to his dissertation research, Ellis is the recipient of the Oliver Cromwell Cox Article Award and the Outstanding Recent Contribution to Social Psychology Award, both from the American Sociological Association for his 2015 article entitled The Cost of Color, Skin Color, subtitle, Skin Color, Discrimination, and Health Among African Americans, an article which was published in the American Journal of Sociology. And his talk today is entitled Rethinking Ethnoracial Inequality in the US and Brazil, the Consequences of Bodily Capital. Please join me in welcoming Ellis Monk.
Well, first of all, thank you for that amazing introduction. Definitely, ooh, okay. All right, let me take a second, That was an amazing introduction. Thank you all for being here today. It's my pleasure to present some of the framing from my book project, as well as some of the findings from some of my empirical studies that have been published or are forthcoming, okay? And what I'll do today is really focus on the USBrazil comparison, focusing not so much in terms of kind of the aggregate census categories that we tend to use in sociology, but focusing on the physical markers of race, skin tone, hair, these sorts of things, okay? Now, the US and Brazil are really arguably two of the most compared cases we have across the social sciences and the humanities when it comes to thinking about race. These are pillars of the transatlantic slave trade. There's lots in common between these two cases. But despite all these similarities, there's one key difference that I always like to illustrate in terms of pictures. And this part's a little interactive, so humor me here a little bit, okay, as we work through this key difference between the US and Brazil. Okay. So on the one hand, we have a picture here of Walter White, co-founder of the NAACP. We have Diane Nash of SNCC. See their pictures there, okay? We have a picture of someone in the middle. Anyone know who that is in the middle there? Any guesses? This part's interactive. Anyone seen this movie about, go ahead. That's right, that's Katherine G. Johnson. Was she cast that way? Okay, all right. But anyhow, so these are prominent African Americans, and as you may note, okay, phenotypically, they're quite atypical to the rest of the category, right? They're quite phenotypically light, all right? Now, on the other hand, we have a picture there of Cardoso, who was a former president of Brazil, okay? He's also a sociologist. So imagine a country that elected a sociologist as president. Reflect on that for a second, okay? And get this, he was a sociologist of race, okay? So a country that elected a sociologist of race as president, okay? And one thing that he's somewhat infamous for saying in the media was that he had a foot in the kitchen, which was his kind of colloquial way of saying that he had African slave ancestry in his family. Okay? But like 33 to 40% of Brazilians, according to white Brazilians, according to most of the national data, there's no real bar to acknowledging having some degree of African ancestry and self-identifying as white, being identified as white, okay? And this is a key difference between the one-drop rule on the one hand and a fluid, kind of ambiguous phenotypical spectrum on the other. Such that Karina Baki, who's pictured here, a Brazilian model, she caught a lot of flack in the press. They told her that, you know, she was having lip augmentation surgery, like she was trying to be a Brazilian Kardashian or something like that. And her way of defending herself was to say she had black ancestry, that her lips were au natural. How dare you say this about me? My dad is black, my grandfather is black. And now if you were to Google her, there's even instances now where people say that she's secretly black, like that they didn't realize this, which is kind of the emergence of more of a one-drop rule style of understanding things in Brazil. And I'll talk about that. But historically and even contemporarily, until very recently, you could acknowledge having this black ancestry, self-identify as white, be identified or ascribe the category white by others, okay? So this is why, for example, we have a book called One Drop that was written by Bliss Broyard about her father, Anatoly. Some of you may know this story. Raise your hand if you've heard about this story. Yeah, okay. And the kind of main angle on the story was that this guy was passing for white, that he didn't tell a lot of people that he had African Creole ancestry going back to Louisiana, and that she didn't actually find out about this, his daughter, until after he had already passed away, okay? But this is really foreign to a Brazilian way of thinking about race, where the idea of passing for a particular category may not make a lot of sense because there's differential weight being placed on ancestry as opposed to phenotype when it comes to the logic of racial classification, okay? And this idea about Brazil having this different way of thinking about racial lines was really popularized by Gilberto Freire here. And one thing that's really clear in his work, okay, and this is the guy who popularized this notion of racial democracy, is this idea that all Brazilians are part of this meta race, okay? This mix of the three sad races, European, African, indigenous, okay? So one thing to note from his diaries that we have access to now are that he actually traveled to the United States at a young age. He went to Baylor University. Anyone know where that is? Where's Baylor? Texas, okay. And he noted that there was a terrible smell in the air when he got there. What do you think that was from? Lynching, yes. And for him, this was a huge shock because in Brazil, in contrast to the United States, there was really no official kind of or unofficial policy of Jim Crow. Lynching was not really a thing in Brazilian history, okay? So this is a huge shock to him. So the one thing to point out about racial democracy, this idea that there are no real racial lines, there's no race problem, was that it was always already a comparison to Brazil, between Brazil and the United States at a very particular point in US history, which was Jim Crow. Now, one thing to note about this idea about Brazil is that it was incredibly popular. So Du Bois in 1914 writes in The Crisis that Brazil is absorbing the Negro. There's no color bar to advancement. E. Franklin Frazier, black sociologist who studied Brazil, also says these things in the first half of the 20th century. And these ideas of thinking about Brazil gained so much steam that UNESCO actually designed a whole series of studies explicitly to glean the secrets of racial harmony for the rest of the world, okay? Now, what do you think happened when this team of anthropologists, sociologists actually went to Brazil to get these secrets, these gems of racial harmony for the rest of the world? What do we think happened? You think they found racial paradise? No, right? So they didn't find that at all. And in fact, this was part of what I'll talk about in a moment, the revisionist turn and how people really attacked this idea of racial democracy. You may have heard this idea, the myth of racial democracy, okay? But in any case, these studies were explicitly designed to kind of glean these secrets of racial harmony. But one of the key things that they found, even though they did not find racial paradise, was that the system of racial classification was different, and that patterns of intermarriage were different than the United States at the very least, okay? Now, this revisionist turn that I speak of really was spearheaded by two South American sociologists who were trained in the US. And what they did was they applied the US black-white framework to the Brazilian case using census data from the IBGE that was recently available in the 1970s. And this was explicitly designed, these quantitative studies, in contrast to the qualitative studies of the past, to disprove the myth of racial democracy. And explicitly, Silva actually argued that there was no violence to reality done by lumping together blacks and browns in the Brazilian context. One thing to note about the Brazilian census is that the three major categories are black, white, and brown, or party, this intermediate category. And they joined them together and said, this actually does no real violence to reality, okay? And what they found, in contradistinction to Degler's work, the mulatto escape hatch, was that there was actually more inequality between non-whites and whites than there was between browns and blacks, okay? And this meant, as far as they were concerned, that fluidity and ambiguity in Brazil, this kind of idea that goes back to racial democracy, was really ideological. And this gave rise to this idea that perhaps Brazil was even more racist than the United States because they had a history of denying the presence of racial lines, even though the system clearly had a racial and phenotypic hierarchy built deep within it, such that darker people were seen to be ugly, less competent, et cetera, kept out of elite social clubs, kept out of certain social circles in terms of occupation, okay, social networks, okay? So this was really a key moment when we think about the history of the trajectory of how people thought about racial inequality in Brazil. Oh, sorry. So I think one key thing to kind of get, going closer to the present are the shifting politics of categorization in Brazil that really were inspired by the work of Silva and Hasenbach. So to translate this says, don't let your color pass for white, which is really a play on words because historically there's been a lot of antipathy to self-identifying as black in the Brazilian context. So this is saying on the one hand, don't let your census classification stay blank. It's also saying in the classic notion of whitening, in the Brazilian case, that you shouldn't elevate your racial self-identification above what other people ascribe you to be in everyday life. This is the idea that socioeconomic status in the Brazilian case may actually lead people of somewhat darker skin tones to self-identify as brown or white when it comes to the census. Now, one thing that's really, I think, important in terms of this shift is at the bottom of this flyer here, which is confirm your African descent, whatever the color of your skin. Okay? Now, what does this sound like to people acquainted with the US? This idea. Go ahead, speak up. One drop, right? Exactly. So what I'm arguing in some of my research today, particularly inspired by the work of Silva and Hasenbach, this turn against this notion of racial democracy, the increasing influence of the United States and how people think about race in the Brazilian case, is the rise of a kind of a one-drop rule, even in the Brazilian context. And you even have in Brazil today forms of affirmative action that are not totally the same as what we have in the US, but boards, tribunals actually trying to distinguish who should or should not count for quotas in the Brazilian case. So this is from NPR covering this, and there's lots of stories like this. And this man tried to apply for a foreign affairs job. So the affirmative action processes in Brazil are not just for higher education, but also for federal employment. And he was denied. He was told that he was not black or black enough to be accepted as Afro-descendant for the purpose of these quotas. Okay? Now, one thing I'd like to point out comparatively when we think about the United States, though, is that while I think it, from the US vantage point, looking at Brazilian, like the trajectory of how people think about blackness in Brazil may seem somewhat strange and foreign to us, there's a few things to point out about the US that are actually parallel, I would argue. One, we didn't always have the one-drop rule in the United States. It took a long time to develop in the United States. South Carolina, Louisiana, different regions of the South openly resisted the adoption of the one-drop rule. There were struggles, political struggles, Garvey, Du Bois, among others, over who should legitimately lead the political vanguard among African Americans. And this overlaid with color politics. Okay? I have a picture there of Roy Wilkins, Thurgood Marshall, Walter White, just to show kind of in photo the amalgamation of African Americans of all skin tones coming together. And this is a process that occurred. I think at this point in time, we can be presentists and believe that this was always the case, but it was not. It's something that developed over time. And it wasn't just the kind of imposition, top down, of Jim Crow violence and segregation that did this. People struggled and fought over these things, just like they're doing today in Brazil, inspired by the United States. Okay? Now, when we think about the kind of history of studying these things in sociology, one key argument that I make is that the study of colorism is not new. I feel like a lot of people interpret, my work within sociology as trying to make a claim to novelty, as if, the study of colorism is something new, and this is explicitly the wrong message to take from my research. Instead, I think this is a lost legacy in the social sciences that has a lot to do with the marginalization of Black sociologists' work in sociology proper. Okay? So Deep South, Black Metropolis, St. Clair Drake, Horace Caton, Black Bourgeoisie by E. Franklin Frazier, they all spoke a great deal about colorism, color politics, okay? And Du Bois talks about in Dusk of Dawn, talks about this instance where he's hesitant to actually court a girl who's very light-skinned because he's worried about how that would be perceived by others within the category. Kind of taboo, but he does say it way back in 1940, okay? So this is not a new topic. This is rather something, I argue, that's been unfairly marginalized within the larger realm of the social sciences. And I think it's actually the key to understanding the link between social categories and inequality on the other hand. I'll say a little bit more about that, okay? But in any case, one consequence of marginalizing this kind of research is that researchers in kind of running towards quantitative research in particular have adopted the one-drop rule as an analytic lens, and they've wiped out all the heterogeneity in the category, okay? And one of the key arguments, just to anticipate where I'm going, is that in so doing, they have a truncated or distorted understanding of the relationship between categories on the one hand and inequality on the other. So colorism matters not just for the sake of understanding colorism, but it also has deep theoretical relevance to how we understand the relationship between social difference and inequality. So these are pictures of the census categories that people typically confront in the US and Brazil. And the kind of running fare in most of research on inequality, particularly racial inequality quantitatively, is that what box you check tells us almost everything we need to know about your education, your health, et cetera, okay? One thing to think about comparatively here is that the definitions of these categories across cases are somewhat incommensurable, right? In one case, someone who says they're Black may not be Black in the other case, say Brazil, and vice versa. So African Americans here who self-identify as Black in the Brazilian case may not actually be identified as Black or Negro in the Brazilian case, which brings up a key issue for the logic of comparison. How do we compare across these two cases, right? A lot of previous work, I argue, has done so without paying attention to the incommensurability of these categories across cases. So they kind of take for granted the fact that there are fundamental differences in the ideas around Blackness and whiteness between these cases. Now, another reason then why colorism, I'm arguing, is the way forward is because it actually allows us to analytically reconstruct the comparison on a more equal plane of analysis, which would be the lightness or darkness of the skin tone of the individual in each society. And in particular, what it allows us to do, in contrast to a lot of existing work, is it allows us to invert the typical analytic gaze when people compare the US and Brazil. So typically what people will do is that they'll understand the Brazilian case in relation to the US case, and the US case is primary in this comparison, such that Brazil becomes a puzzle. So why is it that Blacks in Brazil are not identifying as Black? Why don't they have a social movement? Brazil becomes seen as a problematic case in this formulation. But by focusing on color and inverting this analytic gaze, my step here, my move here, is to get away from problematizing Brazil in these ways and rather trying to have an immanent understanding of the case on its own terms first, and then doing the comparison. And then the other thing is to highlight the ever kind of present consequences of colorism in the US case, where it has been, I would argue, unfairly ignored and marginalized, particularly in quantitative research, which tends to view the world only in terms of a dichotomy, just simply black and white. Okay? Now, in terms of the timing of my project, some of you may have seen some of these sorts of things, right? Anyone seen the National Geographic version of this more recently? They tried to make these faces. And the kind of growing kind of resonance of these kind of approaches to thinking about the future of the United States always tends to draw upon Brazil. Like, the future is Brazil. Yale evolutionary biologist Stephen Stearns once said, maybe just 5 or 6 years ago, that in the future we'll all look Brazilian. Okay, usually people laugh a little bit more, but fair enough. Okay, and the basic idea there is that, you know, in the future there'll be all this race mixture, and then race as we know it will fundamentally shift and change. We'll all be brown, these sorts of things, and that ostensibly is how it is in Brazil. Well, you know, spoiler, I don't think that's actually how it is in Brazil, right? So what does it mean to pose that as the future of the United States when it may not really properly capture what's going on in Brazil? Okay. But before I get into some of the USBrazil findings, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about the broader kind of theoretical message here about the measurement of social inequality. Okay? So typically when sociologists in quantitative research, they study social inequality, what they do is they take groups of individuals and they compare them on various outcomes. They use dummy variables, right? You're either a man or a woman, you're black or you're white or Asian, et cetera, okay? And these types of categories, from the work of Pierre Bourdieu in particular, a sociologist, these are state categories. These are categories that people fought over to get on the census in the first place in a lot of cases, or that the state has decided is valuable to measure, okay? And these state categories, what they tend to do is actually to carve discontinuities into what is really a fundamentally continuous social world. So when we think about things like age and race and gender, one thing to think about here is that these things are not necessarily strictly dichotomous, okay? So things like gender, we can think about continua of perceptions of masculinity and femininity. Things like race, and I'll talk about that today, we can think about continuous perceptions of blackness and whiteness and all these sorts of things, okay? And age, of course, is just fundamentally continuous. But think about the AARP and all these other types of organizations that are cutting discontinuity into the age spectrum to create a politicized category, okay? Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong. Rather, that this can be a form of logical conformism which kind of ties us to viewing the world only through these particular lenses, blinding us to these continuous differences in these types of social difference, right? And as a sociologist, the state actually provides the social statistics in these kind of pre-cooked ways. They provide us findings, financial support for our research, and the continued usage of these kinds of categories are actually ways that we can maintain our own legibility and legitimacy within the broader scientific community. But there are some consequences here. One, there's lack of analytic attention to operative, but perhaps less politically salient and officially institutionalized principles of social vision and division. I would say skin color is one of those for sure. And then, of course, as I've said, there's a distorted and truncated understanding then of the relationship between the commonly used categories we tend to study and the actual mechanisms and processes that lead to the inequality that we detect, okay? And when we think about research design, and this is broader theoretical significance, picking up on someone who taught Pierre Bourdieu, Gaston Bachelard, one of the kind of principles of sociological research that we even see in Emile Durkheim's work is this idea of having to break with pre-notions about the social world before we actually do our research in the social world. And to expand upon this idea, the idea here is that we should be breaking with multiple forms of common sense, ordinary, policy, and scholarly, and forge our own robust analytic concepts to have a different kind of view on what's going on in the social world that's not so beholden to the kind of categories that we just take for granted all the time, okay? And specifically, right, some of the consequences when we think about the measurement of inequality is misspecification. So that's when orthogonal categories are actually somewhat more important than just being in a category. And misattribution, when there are causal effects, but the causal effects of race are not really that you're just black, but you're in a subcategory nested within that broader category, okay? So lots of kind of broader theoretical points, but a concrete example, okay? So this comes from a paper I did on health, okay? Anyone heard about the BlackWhite mental health paradox? Anyone? No? Okay, so the idea here is that the health of blacks on average, their physical health, is actually worse than whites on average, and that is like duh, right? We all get that. But the paradox part of this is that African Americans' mental health, according to a lot of research, is actually somewhat similar to whites or even better than whites overall. And this has led some people in the public health community to argue that African Americans actually thrive in the face of racial discrimination, which I think, and I guess I'm being recorded, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think it's a little dangerous, that idea. So what I did was I looked within the black population along the skin color continuum, and I used multiple measures of perceived discrimination that pick up on colorism. One that's perceived colorism within the black population and perceived colorism from whites. And one of the things that I noted in taking this different approach is that there's a curvilinear relationship between skin tone and perceived discrimination, such that people who are very light-skinned and very dark-skinned both perceive dramatically more intra-racial color discrimination than those in the middle of the category. Now, I think that may resonate with a lot of African Americans. I think that may resonate with their own personal experiences. But the consequence there is that the relationship between race and depression is much more complex than a simple dichotomy. Specifically, very dark-skinned blacks and very light-skinned blacks actually have higher rates, or at least somewhat similar rates of depression than whites as a whole. And for me, this actually dissolves then the black-white mental health paradox. It's really a matter of multiple dimensions of perceived discrimination within the category that have a lot to do with differences in skin tone, okay? Now, in terms of kind of the theories that I'm working with here to think about colorism and to really deepen its theoretical relationship, Wittgenstein's work on family resemblances also plays a large role in this as well. So there is a psychologist at UC Berkeley, Eleanor Roche. This part's interactive, so be ready for this, okay? And she did these experiments with birds. So what she did was simply, name a bird, any bird, name a bird. Thrush. Blue jay. Usually I get penguin eventually, things like that. Okay, there you go. Fair enough. Pigeon. Ostrich, there you go. So the main thing that's going on there, according to the work of Eleanor Roche, picking up on Wittgenstein's kind of insights, is that we're all naming members of the category bird, but there's nothing necessarily in common across all those instances. There's no necessary and sufficient condition for membership in the category bird. And that means that there's an internal, gradational, and very complicated thing that's going on within the category, okay? When we think about social categories, we can think about this in similar terms as well. It's not simply that we perceive someone to be in a category, but we also perceive their typicality with respect to a category, okay? And this is where colorism comes into play again, right? Because the idea there is that we don't just simply perceive whether or not someone is black or white or what have you. We use, a lot of the time, their phenotypical traits to place them on this continuous spectrum, okay? And one of the key kind of theoretical arguments here, then, is that when we use census categories, we are treating all individuals in that category as if they were equally prototypical. But in reality, that can't be the case, okay? So for me, this picks up on analytically disaggregating categories down to their bodily markers, which I talk about in terms of bodily capital. Thinking not so much in terms of the census categories, but directly measuring aspects of the body that signify an interaction, categorical membership. It does this dichotomously, it does this continuously, and in some instances, it does this independent of explicit social categorization. So when we think more broadly, skin tone is part of this. But there's also things like height, weight, facial morphology. I have social psych experiments I'm running now in the US and Brazil on this. Hair, perceptions of physical attractiveness or beauty, all of these different ways of thinking about what the body is giving off an interaction that we tend not to measure using standard census-style categories in our research, particularly in sociology. And I'm arguing that we need to confront all of this kind of heterogeneity, because not only are they independently important for understanding inequality, but they also can reshape how we think about racial inequality, how we think about gender inequality, and it also gives us a tractable window to understand intersectionality, particularly in quantitative research. Okay? So a couple of examples that are not my research, okay? I think this really captures this idea perfectly, this study. Some of you may have seen this study. And the main idea here is that for black men, as the headline says, being tall increases the probability that they'll be stopped. But for white men, there's no effect at all. What is this telling us, right? It's telling us that the physical body, its attributes, are interacting with racial stereotypes. And that this height, which is usually positive across the social world, associated with all kinds of halo effects about dominance and competence, is actually penalized for black men, interacting with racial stereotypes about the threat of black men, right? This comes from the work of Jennifer Eberhardt. And the finding here is that in cases with white victims, those African Americans of darker skin tone, more Afrocentric features, were much more likely to be sentenced to death than all other African Americans. Again, this is showing you the kind of intersectional gaze at work and taking it out. I think in sociology, one thing is to say, intersectionality gets said a lot, but it also gets mocked, okay? Like, how can we actually be intersectional? But this, I think, is a clear example of that. And it gives us a much more fine-tuned understanding of how race is operating in the social world, that it has these effects. So from my own research, this is from a paper that Professor Wilson mentioned that was recently published, The Color of Punishment. I actually show, using nationally representative data, that the darker your skin tone, the higher probability it is that an African American man in particular will have ever been arrested during his life. And you can see there the kind of typical gap that we would see between blacks and whites. But note that the gap along the color continuum is actually as large as the gap between blacks and whites as a whole. Okay? And this is a predicted probability plot. This is after I control for all the things that the reviewers want me to control for, basically. And it's one of the straightest lines I've ever seen in my life, which pretty terrifyingly shows that the predicted probability of ever having been arrested for the darkest skinned black men is 65%. Okay? This is after I control for their education, delinquency, everything I could think of. Okay? And I have similar results for incarceration. Okay? But one quick thing to note is that there's a lot of conflict in the study of criminal justice outcomes because people argue that there's unobservable heterogeneity between blacks and whites. So how can you actually detect racial bias in the criminal justice system if blacks and whites are living in fundamentally different worlds? So a lot of people in criminology actually do not believe that there is racial bias. But one other feature of the colorism design is that I'm able to, within race, detect racial bias by looking at skin tone. So I submit, what else would explain these kind of findings once I've effectively held race constant and controlled for SES, controlled for neighborhood conditions within the black population, and still get these kind of strong results for arrest and incarceration? So again, colorism, I think, and thinking about the body, is another way, theoretically and methodologically, to add a lot more depth to our conversation about racial inequality in this country and beyond. So in terms of the US-Brazil comparison, because the data sets are not entirely comparable, I'll focus on education. And the question here is really, does skin tone stratification persist among African Americans in the 21st century? Believe it or not, there was a paper published in a very prominent sociology journal arguing that colorism was a thing of the past. So for any of the grad students in the audience, here's a really low-hanging fruit. kind of way. Like, is it really over? Let me go get some data and actually test this, right? Okay. So first publication I ever had was this. And what it shows very clearly, I think, is that colorism is not a thing of the past. If we look at a standard black-white comparison in terms of education, we see a 10.2-month gap. But what's the color gap? 15.4 months within the black population. And this is data taken early 2000s. This is not from like the 1950s, 1940s, where these effects were originally found, okay? Which is already showing, I would argue, that there's as much or perhaps more inequality in terms of education within the black population along the color continuum than there is between blacks and whites as a whole, okay? This doesn't mean that race doesn't matter. It means that race matters so much that people are paying attention to these fine-tuned distinctions in color. So if we look at the gap between whites and the light-skinned African Americans, we see a gap there of only 4 months. This is similar in terms of employment and labor market outcomes in the work of Sandy Darity, who found that wage distinctions between blacks and whites and light-skinned African Americans and whites were actually somewhat indistinguishable. So that gap between those who are very light-skinned and the rest of the category and the gap between blacks and whites tends to be somewhat similar. Okay? But one thing to kind of highlight from these findings is that the gap between the lightest skin and those in the middle of the color continuum, 40 to 50% of blacks, is equivalent to the black-white gap, 10.2 months. Okay? And here's a regression analysis where I control for things, trust me. Okay, all right. Now in Brazil, the question is slightly different because in Brazil, we have multiple ways of thinking about race. So on the one hand, we have the Brazilian census categories. On the other hand, we have skin tone as judged by interviewers, which is what I'm using in both of these cases, interviewer-rated skin tone, okay? And we also have a more dichotomous US way of thinking about race that's really emerging in Brazil now, which is the Negro category, which is the joining of the brown and the black category into a single category, okay? So, basic descriptive statistics here. If we do a standard black-white comparison, we see a gap of 8 months. If we combine and create this Negro category, we see that the inequality in terms of education is actually diminished. So that may lead to underestimates of racial inequality in the country, moving over to this dichotomous mode. But within the Brazilian population at large, thinking in terms of skin tone, there's actually a gap there of nearly 2 years. So again, I offer across these two cases, skin tone is, I think, a much better way at measuring racial inequality in these two cases than using these aggregate dichotomous categories that kind of lump everyone together. And it may lead us to underestimate the magnitude of racial inequality in our societies to the extent that we ignore skin tone, okay? Here, the regression models are somewhat important. The middle one is just showing that even after we take census classification into account, it's skin color that's predicting inequality in Brazil, not just what you think you are, but rather what other people think you are, in this very fine-tuned and continuous way that picks up on bodily and phenotypical difference. Okay? Any questions so far? No? Go ahead. Sure. Okay, sure. So Pardo, brown, preto, black, right? When you combine those two together, you get negro. All right. And then branca is just white, basically. Okay? Go ahead. Well, may I take the more substantive questions at the end, but I show a regression, like, all right, what are some of the questions? Go ahead.
Are you also able to control for the physical features besides skin color in that?
Not in this, no. Yep, and I'll definitely talk about that a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned the census categories, the three census categories.
Mm-hmm.
When did they adopt them? Because when I was there in the 80s, consulting with the Senate right after the return of democracy, or civilian rule, at least,
Sure.
at least for the military. The categories was like going into Baskin Robbins. You had to choose like between 37 different
Sure.
groups.
Right.
And I remember the wife of a friend of mine who was the ambassador of Cote d'Ivoire to Brazil took her child to the hospital.
Right.
And the form asked for the color. She was going to put black, and they said, "Oh, no, you're not black." Now she's far darker than I,
Yeah.
because skin color had to do, or race had to do much more with social status.
That's right. That's
than
right.
anything else. So that's why I was kind of surprised to see that the census now only has those three categories.
Okay, so I'll take that up really quickly. So since the 1970s, essentially, Brazil has collected these three major categories of black, brown, and white. Over 97% of the Brazilian population self-identifies into one of those categories. But that's not the only kind of racial categorical scheme that people use. They also have this category moreno, which almost anyone could fit into unless they're blonde and like blue-eyed and all of that, okay? The other thing to think about here that you raised is this idea of the endogeneity of racial classification in Brazil, right? So SES is actually propelling people to change their racial classification. That's true. I think it's been somewhat overstated, but it's true. But this is another reason why we should look at skin tone and not the racial categories, because ostensibly, using the skin tone categories just kind of rated by interviewers is not as subject to this kind of fluctuation in terms of endogeneity. Okay?
Can you just talk to us a little bit about, I mean, when I think, well, how do people, sorry, when I think, well, how do people of African descent get light?
Oh, yeah.
We know how that goes. So,
Yep.
but that also sometimes when that happens, people are getting other kinds of benefits, right? So
Yes.
if you have a white, grandparent and so on, white people have more wealth
Yep.
and other kinds of things. And
Absolutely
so it's, I was just wondering what you would say. How are you able to pull apart how much of it is sort of color-based discrimination?
Sure.
And how much of it just has to do with other kinds of advantages you get from being associated with whites?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually argue that what we have is a simultaneous kind of process of intergenerational inequality that you're picking up on. I think that's totally right. And in this generation, color discrimination, and they both coexist. And it's hard to adjudicate statistically how much is A and how much is B. In the statistical models, I have controls for things like mothers' education, parents' occupational status. Those are kind of the only proxies quantitatively that people can use. But I'm actually somewhat agnostic to, in the kind of pie chart, what percentage is this and what percentage is that. The other thing to think about is assortative mating. And I have findings on that as well, where you find color relationships in terms of the marital status of the person or how much education the spouse has. So there is this intergenerational aspect to it that's happening in this generation on top of that. So it is complicated, but I think you're right. Any other questions on that? Okay. So just to kind of wrap up the US-Brazil part of this, right? I'm arguing that the census categories actually obscure skin tone stratification in each case, all right? And that really there's a false dichotomy being drawn between Latin Americanization and Americanization in a lot of the popular and academic literature, okay? In particular, the US already shows the coexistence of multiple ways of conceptualizing the domain of race and ethnicity. Lakoff says, and using the example of electricity, that you can conceptualize electricity as a bundle of atoms or as fluid, and it's equally valid depending on how you're actually setting up your experiment. Well, the same goes for race. You can think about it, you can conceptualize the domain dichotomously, and you can conceptualize the domain continuously. And the US has really shown that both of these modes coexist and people flip between the two all the time. So this idea that the US is becoming Latin American because it's continuous and phenotypical flies in the face of US history. And if anything, it's the US that's more complex than Brazil, which until very recently has not really had anything close to the one-drop rule. And this is really flipping the argument then on its head, okay? All right, so when we think about the definition of race, a lot of the definitions we get in our textbook say things about phenotype, physiognomy, okay? But that already goes against the one-drop rule, which was really determined by ancestry, okay? So I would argue already that the kind of textbook definitions that we get a lot of the times when we think about the definition of race from the US, in US textbooks, actually ignores the one-drop rule in the case of African Americans from the very beginning, which is very puzzling to me, okay? But then it is also the case that things like ancestry matter when we think about race concepts. And when we think about race concepts comparatively then, I'm arguing that we need a concept that can actually let us distinguish between ancestry, phenotype, and even social cultural elements as these three major components when we think all over the world through time and space, how people have used notions of race, ethnicity to divide up human populations. So one quick question to the audience. How many of you have heard of the MENA category? MENA? The MENA category? Anyone heard of the MENA category? No? Good. That's right, Middle Eastern, North African. So I was invited to go to the Census as an expert. I was like, whoa, me? Okay, but all right, sure, I'll go. And we discussed the MENA category, and one of the main concerns that people had was that it was the racialization of a religious distinction, okay? And in particular, being Muslim. And when we looked at the test results, the only people who self-identified consistently as MENA were people from the Middle East. And one thing that in particular, Muslims from the Middle East or North Africa. And one thing to note in particular, how are they categorized today on the census? Anyone know?
I know we did some work in Census, and it's Northern African and Middle East are classified as white.
That's right, they're classified as white. That's exactly right. So what happened in this case was that people had their own organizations, Middle Eastern, North African people of Muslim religion, to actually advocate for a new state category on the census, which would capture the fact that from their point of view, and I think it's justifiable, they did not feel as if they were being treated as white, yet the census was telling them to identify as white, right? So when we think about things like race, I think one thing that doesn't get a lot of attention is how people racialize religion. And if we go back historically and we think about anti-Semitism, right, and these sorts of things going back to 1300s even, okay, religion was one of the key ways that people were racialized as well. So we can't just think about phenotype, we can't just think about ancestry, we also have to think about social cultural elements like religion that also can be key parts of racialization processes, okay? And these different components, insofar as quantitative research is concerned, I argue, can be measured by a mix of self-identification, interviewer ascription, and the key thing here is that these components, each of these components, can be thought of continuously as well as dichotomously to tap into the fundamental heterogeneity in the social world that a lot of our strictly dichotomous measures simply ignore. So I'll end on this example of bodily capital in action. Okay, so some of you may be acquainted with the study of pulchronomics, this idea that physical attractiveness has these clear effects in the social world and the labor market in particular. And one of the real proponents of this work, the economist Dan Hammermesh, has this book, Beauty Pays. One of the things he notes on page like 9 or 10 is that we don't know if race and gender interact when it comes to the kind of effects or consequences of perceived attractiveness on the labor market. So using nationally representative data that's longitudinal, collected across 4 different waves, we have interviewers who have rated people's physical attractiveness, okay? And we use a structural equation model to create like a fancy average, like a latent physical attractiveness score. And taking a fully intersectional approach, the question here is the distribution of perceived physical attractiveness from the vantage point of a pool of mostly white interviewers racialized and gendered? And what we find, of course, is that it is, okay? It's heavily racialized, it's heavily gendered, such that black women in particular are the least likely to be rated as highly physically attractive from the vantage point of this pool of mostly white interviewers, okay? And you can see the distribution here. For black men, you see a similar kind of effect, but the gender effect is more flat, which is already showing you that attractiveness on the labor market may be something that matters in particular for women, okay? And when we look at the returns to attractiveness on the labor market, what we see here is that, and I think this is even more clear, for black women who are rated at the highest level of attractiveness, their earnings actually cross over with white women at the same level of perceived attractiveness, okay? So what we see here is the interaction of race, gender, perceptions of beauty, and its effects on the labor market, okay? And the reason why I highlight this is that, one, attractiveness matters for everyone. So we see there that the standard black-white gap using these same data is only 13%, which is a lot, but look at the attractiveness gap for white men, 22%. But for black women, it's 48%, okay? A massive disparity in earnings among black women after I control for basically everything, okay? Much larger than the standard race gap, much larger than the gender gap, okay? And one thing that I'd like to close on then when we think about this, going back to what I said about state categories and not paying attention to these other ways that social inequality operate, is that lookism is legal, right? People think about inequality, racial inequality in terms of just the civil rights clause and the laws of 1964, but to the extent that lookism is legal and perceptions of physical attractiveness are racialized and gendered, this is a perfectly legal channel through which racial inequality can be maintained on the labor market, education, et cetera. And one kind of quick anecdote here. Pay attention to all the different stories that you see in the news talking about black women's hair, right? And how it's legal. But this is a way that they are discriminated against on the labor market and education that our standard apparatus of civil rights is hard, can't really deal with, okay? It can barely deal with colorism lawsuits. So imagine this, okay? It's all in there.
Hi, thank you. This spoke to me a lot. I'm born and raised in New Orleans, so this has affected me all of my life. So my question was, particularly at the end, when you go into the ideas of the wage gap for black women, did you also look at skin color of black women? Because you were speaking about the labor market, but what goes more into my work is the social market, right?
Sure.
Marriageability, right? Because that's another way in which you get access to capital. You get
Sure.
your children get access to capital.
Right.
So is there a way of looking at how skin color of black women affects their wages as well as their physical attractiveness and
Yes.
their marketability on the social dating market?
Yep. Okay, so in these analyses, we actually control for skin color. So it's the effect of attractiveness net of skin color, but skin color, when we do the analyses with skin color, you do see a wage effect. This is an unpublished paper though, but yes, there is a skin color effect. What I have published though is that in terms of the marriage market, what I find using nationally representative data is that black women of very light skin tone, their spouses on average have 1 more year of education.
So thank you. I have a few questions. Actually, I'll try to be brief. When you're talking about Brazil, I know that one way that some Brazilian scholars have pushed back against the kind of myth of racial democracy is to discuss the history of black protest or protest movements in Brazil around the question of race, or to point to sort of ethnographic research on like police violence in Brazil. And I wonder what you make of those arguments as ways to talk about how black Brazilians have been treated or dark-skinned Brazilians have been treated. The other question I had was, when you talk about, I guess, the effect of the one-drop rule in Brazil, I'm wondering what you think of U.S. notions of color changing. For instance, you know, Ronda Rousey, the Ultimate Fighter, she appears to be white to most people, but I think her great-grandfather or something was like the first black doctor in Massachusetts. But even when that was revealed, people thought, oh, Ronda Rousey's grandfather is black. Not that she's now black because of that. And
That's right.
in an earlier moment, people would have said, oh, I didn't know Ronda Rousey was black, right? So, and then there was this guy who discovered he had African ancestry through 23andMe and wanted to apply for minority business contract, that kind of thing. So do you see a change in the U.S.? I mean, I like your approach, which is to say these paradigms are in place in both places, and not to reduce them, but I wonder if you think it's changing. And then the final question I have is about capital.
Well, I should have wrote some stuff down.
No,
Go
it's
ahead.
good. And we can talk about it afterwards, but capital, I often wonder what's at stake in social capital, bodily capital versus capital, right? Because your research suggests what you're talking about is capital. Like people will say, okay, boarding schools, country clubs, social capital, but in fact it's also capital. I don't know to what extent it matters to differentiate. So,
Okay.
and we can talk about any of this more later.
Okay, so I'll try to pick up a couple of those threads. One, I think the idea of capital is important because it has inherent relationality built into it. So even though I understand that the metaphor is overused, I like it because one, it kind of quickly gets us to the idea that people are exchanging it, that's relational, all right?
Social capital versus capital, or bottom capital versus capital, why not just capital?
Oh, okay. Because I think we need to pay attention to the different forms of capital. They're not all the same. So I think that's why I like to distinguish. And then we can pay attention to how, say, having a certain portfolio of bodily capital facilitates the acquisition of social capital and networks, right? In terms of are things changing? Yes, I think they are, but not that fast. So I think there are exceptional cases in the media, but also pay attention to the case of Rachel Dolezal. So I think, you know, progress is never like this linear thing, and change is never this linear thing either. So what we have are like these fits and starts over change. So you'll have these exceptional cases like you highlight, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in the distribution, what's modal is not still just kind of acting as if the one drop rule is operating. But this also gets us to the role of phenotype in all of this racial classification stuff, right? Which is, regardless of what you say about your ancestry, and this picks up on my kind of light skin discrimination research, you may not be seen as a legitimate or fully legitimate member of the category because you look too light. And this may be one way of interpreting the Ronda Rousey case.
Yes, I have a question first. What surveys or studies are you using that are identifying skin tone? And I know you say you're doing social psychological experiments. So could you describe those a little bit? I'm a social scientist as well, so I'm interested in hearing about that. And then my second, well, this is more of a comment, that there's a lot of research within political science looking at colorism within the Black community and the impact that it has on self-hate, right? So internalized hatred. DeAndre Ori is looking at a lot of that, and he's doing experiments as well. So that may be something.
All right, so first I'll pick up self-hatred. You know, this comes up when people talk about colorism. It makes me really uncomfortable. And one reason why is because we have to think about, and this is where Fanon comes in, this is where Du Bois comes in, one of the effects of living in a society that's shot through with white supremacy is that people, regardless of the category they're in, are going to perceive the world through a very similar lens. In Bourdieu's work, this is known as symbolic violence, but we can think about this in terms of double consciousness or a variant thereof. We can think about this in terms of the psychodynamics of desire that Fanon talks about. So for me, self-hatred really short circuits and truncates a deeper understanding of the consequences of racial domination. And part of my research, of course, is picking up on this. But one way that white supremacy proceeds, or racial domination proceeds, is by recruiting members of the stigmatized category as agents in the system. It doesn't mean they hate themselves. That means that's the way the system works, right? So I think we need to depathologize a little bit.
Yes, and that probably was the wrong terminology. But even with thinking about that, one other thing you said, and I'll let you answer the question about surveys, was about the racialization of religion. When you were talking about the adoption of the MENA category within the white racial category of the census, right? And so one thing you were saying was the racialization of religion, but I was wondering if it is actually that, or is it what you're talking about with this whole idea of white supremacy co-opting certain groups when they're moving towards or talking about or discussing this whole browning of America, right? And so to expand the racial categorization of whiteness to include those, that MENA category that you were talking about before.
Right, yeah. So first of all, the surveys. These are often restricted access surveys that no one really even knows about. So I won't say too much about them,
Okay.
but you can contact me, I'll let you know. It's just really hard to get your hands on data with skin tone
Yes.
or attractiveness or any of these things. It was a struggle for me in grad school, wanting to do this research. In terms of thinking about the kind of future projections that people are making, majority, minority, and all these sorts of things, one kind of issue, though, of course, is that the understanding of the category will remain constant throughout the future. So I think one thing that you're already highlighting there is that the understanding of the category white may actually shift and change as the boundaries may expand or contract. Now, one way to think about the MENA category, though, is that it's actually the purification of the white category. Because what that is doing is reducing the kind of people who would be compelled to self-identify as white, right? It's basically taking these people who are told they're white and telling them now, like, no, you should self-identify with this other category. Now, one thing to note there is that it was something that developed on the ground from people who were dissatisfied with racism, right? But there's this strange way that it plays into kind of changing the boundaries of whiteness, right, in terms of the census. So these things are really complex. I try not to take one stance or the other. We have to see how they develop. But one thing to keep in mind is that they are always changing.
Okay, so two questions. The first is, have you thought about doing some kind of like big data type of, research with the information regarding attractiveness of Black women and like coming out with like some kind of algorithm of what is considered attractive, right? What size eyes, what size nose, what kind of teeth, what kind of lips, how curly does the hair need to be, and like show us what that prototypical attractive Black woman looks like. That could be really interesting.
We could do that.
And then the other
Don't
thing,
get me fired, though. I just got here.
the other thing is thinking about immigration from African, Caribbean countries in the U.S. and understanding that there's a lot of colorism, particularly from the Caribbean, but thinking about perhaps Nigerians who tend to be darker than most native-born African Americans who have some level of mixture, right, to a certain extent, right? Like we probably have at least 4% or something of that nature on average for a native-born African American, right? And so we tend to not have a particular type of look, right? Like that is what kind of is the African American look. It's like you look like an amalgamation of all kinds of things, including not being the darkest often complexions. And so then thinking about how the privileged Nigerians who are darker can come and be read as distinct from native-born African Americans because of all of their, their features, their bodies, their, accents and things of that nature. But they are darker than the, prototypical Black person. Like, how are those things, playing together?
Right. So excellent points. I mean, I won't go all the way back, but this is why I like to think in terms of a portfolio of bodily capital and think about disaggregating all the signals that the body is giving off. And the argument here is not that skin tone rules everything, but rather that it's one thing that rules a lot of things. But of course, we can think about facial morphology. This is what I'm doing with a collaborator at Princeton, Alex Todorov, who's like an expert on faces. And we've designed continuous spectra of faces that vary in terms of their skin tone and facial morphology. And we're looking at experiments, the stereotype content model, and perceptions of different racial categories as well across cases to try to get some kind of tractable way to deal with these fundamental differences in facial morphology that we typically ignore in our research, right? You mentioned accent. That's something else the body is giving off, right? So again, one way of viewing my research and to really be humble about it is that it's really a first step on a longer pathway to dealing with the centrality of the body in processes of inequality and stratification.
This is fascinating, Ellis. In the beginning of your talk, you talked about the marginalization of black sociologists like E. Franklin Frazier, W.B. Du Bois, who worked on some of the very issues that you are addressing in your research. Now, someone outside of sociology could draw the conclusion that your research has also been marginalized, if they're not in the discipline. But I get the sense that your research is drawing a lot of attention in the discipline, is having a significant impact on the way we think about the relationship between social categories and inequality. Just wanted you to speak to that.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think you're right. I mean, I am arguing that this research has been very, very much marginalized and ignored. But I don't think things always stay the same. I think sometimes there's a timing aspect to these things. That's why I showed the slide on Latin Americanization. Increased concern over Brazil also brought to the fore these ideas of color being important. But I also think another aspect of my research that made it a little bit more amenable was that it was quantitative as opposed to strictly qualitative, even though I think we need it all, okay? So just in terms of the strategy of the research, being able to show quantitatively the differences in the inequality estimates using their way of doing it and this other way, I think that's been helpful in its impact.
Ellis, this was a tremendous talk. It's one of the reasons we're so excited to have you here. My mind is spinning with all of the things that you brought up, but I wanted to kind of hone in on what you ended on and to press you on some of the implications for politics, because I was actually kind of surprised that you pivoted towards civil rights law. And I just wanted to ask you two other questions about politics that came up from your talk. One was whether you think African Americans are in an impossible bind politically. And the way I would put this is...
Brandon, I've known you a long time.
Well, I just want to put it like this, so that you need an expansive solidarity, that many African Americans imagine you need a very expansive solidarity so that they actually end up having, in some respects, an investment in the one-drop rule, because it increases the number of people that you might be able to have solidarity with, who have some semblance of vulnerability to these questions. But at the same time, if the people in the group who have the most power, who can dictate the agenda, who might have different points of emphasis, are going to continuously be light-skinned people because of the dynamics, or at least at this moment would be light-skinned because of the dynamics you've identified, does it kind of paralyze us politically? The traditional project of racial solidarity paralyze us in dealing with these questions of dark skin discrimination. So that's the first question.
Oh, wow. Can I just take the first one first?
No, I gotta get this other one. And
all right.
The second one was, I was really curious as to your thoughts, again, a kind of pivot away from civil rights legislation, about the implications your work might have for us rethinking the aesthetic projects of the Black Power movement. So it's very easy to mock the overly didactic and often essentialist projects of Black Power aesthetics. But it does strike me, seeing your data again, it's that, this is about visual cues. It's about what you're calling bodily capital. It's about a perceptual register, and how could we adjust that in any other dynamic without some concerted aesthetic effort to get at the revaluation of skin color?
Yeah. So the politics thing first, and we'll still be friends even though you asked me that question.
Best friends, that's.
There you go. I do think it is somewhat of a bind, right? Because on the one hand, you have to maintain aggregate solidarity based on kind of the broad category, regardless of color. On the other hand, you have the color politics within the category that have to be dealt with. But I think not acknowledging it is not going to work. I guess the second thing I would say to that is, how can I put this delicately and on film? Politics has an aspect of altruism to it. We don't share the same positionality as our neighbor, right? We just don't. We're all different, regardless of the categories we belong to. I'm pointing to bodily differences, but we're different in a lot of different ways. So I think we have to learn, in terms of our politics in these aggregate categories, how to hold these other differences in abeyance and actually strive towards a collective goal. And again, ignoring all of these internal differences won't get you there, because they're still operating. As I'm showing, they're still operating. So I think we need to be able to kind of admit the high bar for political solidarity. It's a really high bar because we have all these differences. So, you know, I just think we have to deal with those differences and be able to try to do both. We have to acknowledge the struggle of the category as a whole while also acknowledging the struggles within the category. I mean, in terms of the aesthetic standards, I mean, one study that I cite from the 70s shows that even at the height of the Black Power movement, surveys were done among African Americans, and you still had people who were willing, even regardless of social desirability bias, to assume that darker-skinned people were less competent, lighter-skinned people were more competent, more beautiful, and this was at the height of the Black Power movement. So the question there is even about like the causal efficacy of the movement to actually shift some of these standards, even beyond the question of do we need it, but what is the efficacy of it, you know? So, yeah.
So in your presentation, something that was on the back of my mind was this 1929 novel by Nella Larson called Passing. So, and I think interestingly, one of the characters, I think Brian, that's his name, actually talked about going to Brazil towards the end of the novel, supposedly because they have a more relaxed notion of race concept there. But my question is more on your categorization of the skin tones. So I think you had used this terminology of very light, and somewhat light. So do you consider these subjects in your research as being able to pass as white, or how do you identify them? And on a related note, what do you suggest as sufficient to capture the range of skin tones? How many? I think at one point you had 8 categories, and the other slide you were just using black, white, very black for the health research. How many categories do you suggest would be sufficient?
Okay, so the surveys I use typically have 7 to 10 points. That usually gives you enough, distribution in terms of the continuum. In terms of, thinking through, can you restate your first question a little bit? Because, so there are a small number of multiracials that are in the sample that I use, right? But it's hard for me to say whether or not they are actually able to pass for white just from the measures. So maybe that's one way to think about it, right? Of course, certainly it could be the case that people who are not explicitly multi or biracial could also pass, right? Not in this generation, but from the data, it's hard to determine that.
Cornell, you go first. Though I'm breaking my rule never to speak after you, but you should go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, our new chairman. It's a blessing to have you. But thank you for just such a subtle and nuanced paper, though I actually was challenged in many ways, and it's just a blessing to have you as a colleague. I want to get back to this issue, though, of how do we keep track of the degrees of violence, the degrees of fear, and the degrees of hatred. See, because when you say, okay, it's a false dichotomy now between Brazil and the United States, but 1888 or so, they still had slave importation. they had slave reproduction here beginning way back in 1800. So
Right.
the violence that is integral to the reproduction of a black labor force, and most importantly, the deployment of a repressive apparatus against black folk
Right.
that was so vicious that they don't have a history of lynching, they don't have a history of Jim Crow, they don't have a history of terrorism the way black people here in the United States,
Right.
even across color, because the colorism is real, the hueism is real,
Yep.
but if you know you can be treated by the police this way, you can be hanging from a tree this way, you can have your wife spit on this way, you can have your sister violated and raped this way, that raw violence is something that I think sociologists and social scientists have to be able to capture in terms of the lived experience of black folk.
Absolutely.
You
Yep.
with me on that?
I'm totally with you
Yeah,
on
yeah,
this. These are the kind of issues that I try to take up in the book, which is about in-depth interviews and ethnographic observation, because the numbers won't get you there.
Yeah, exactly.
They just won't. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. The numbers alone will not get you there. This is why I conducted interviews in the US and Brazil, and really it was more about like life history and storytelling, and to make sense of some of these cold hard facts, because we have to pay attention to the subjective lived experience of racial domination, of violence in these two societies. You're totally right. And that's what I think the work that my book is really focusing on doing. And one kind of instance from the interviews that I got was a case in Brazil where a young woman who is, I guess, explicitly mixed race decided to adopt a Negro or Negro identity. And her black mother, who was darker than her, was totally opposed to this. And the daughter decided to have dreadlocks. And one night, what did the mother do? She cut them off in the middle of the night, okay? This is like the psychological damage, how it does work on people, and the numbers, again, don't get you this, right? So that's why, even though a lot of my research has been quantitative, I definitely believe that we need to be theoretically rich about this. We need to pay attention to the lived experience, and certainly comparatively in Brazil, without Jim Crow, without these overt systems, and I try not to say which one is more or less racist, but the US history is very unique still. It's very, very unique, and we have to pay attention to that.
I just wanted to ask a question. I think it's a basic one, just about how you interpret the one-drop rule. And I realize it's contested, and it may not be totally, a settled consensus about how to apply it. But something you said surprised me about with the focus on ancestry, because I guess I would have thought that the way that the rule works is it works at disambiguate cases. So you stay in standard case, you have a black person who fits a certain phenotypic profile. It includes not just skin color, but other things like facial morphology, other kinds of things.
Yeah.
Plus African ancestry, and they got to go together, right? Because there are people who might be from Africa, from the continent, who wouldn't be considered black. And the way the one-drop rule works, this is as I think of it. You'll tell me I'm wrong because you actually studied this. But,
Maybe not. No.
Is to disambiguate, because usually gross morphology in color gives you enough information to determine whether a person's black. But then there's the cases where it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't tell you enough. Either you don't know, where the person's from. Maybe they look dark, but they're really from South Asia. They're not really from.
Right.
Or they're very light, but maybe you think they might have African ancestors. So you invoke the one-drop rule to disambiguate those cases. So it's not really strictly an ancestry criterion. I would
Sure.
have thought. I'm just wondering if you think that's right, and how you're interpreting the way that the rule works in the U.S.
Sure,
in the US
sure.
case. You see what I'm asking?
Yep, absolutely right. So I think we need to distinguish between everyday life and kind of the lived experience of racial ascription and self-identification and the standards of the U.S. Census, right? So I think you're totally right about the lived experience of ascription and self-identification, which is of course a combination then of A and B, which would be the phenotype and the ancestry kind of playing off one another, and this disambiguation that you speak of. Absolutely right. But in terms of the census standards, right, arguably one could think that the kind of legal writ, when we think about the US and its trajectory, has been that if you have African ancestry, even one drop of it, thinking about the Phipps case all the way into the 80s, that was your legal construction of race, and that had to do with ancestry and not phenotype. So when I'm talking about the one-drop rule in that sense, I mean more the legalistic kind of trajectory of the category over time, and not the lived experience, which of course is more about, in this marginal case, we're using phenotype and ancestry in conjunction. Yep.
It's interesting being here, because I'm looking at colorism, skin color, as an African.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to see how the black skin color is treated here in the same way also in Africa. Like the lighter your skin color is, for example, in Nigeria, it's based on how employable you are,
Yep.
how you advance in life, how you're seen in the television, and all that. And I'm also looking at trying to ask a question about when Africans migrate to the US.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of not self-hate, but lots of self-worth in terms of meeting up to other blacks in America, in terms of accent and other things. What do you think is the cause?
Ooh, what do I think is the cause? Wow, okay. Well, I'll take the first one, right? So as you point out about Nigeria, and just thinking about what I'm talking about in a more global way, Nigeria is one of the countries with the highest rate of importing skin lightening cream, okay? So when I talk about skin tone, colorism, these are global issues that we need to consider in a comparative way, right? So it's not just the case that it's African Americans or Brazilians, right? India as well, huge issue. All right, so these are global issues. In terms of like thinking through what are the causes though, this gets us back to fundamental things about the social world. You said yourself, employment. People brought up things in the marriage market. These are the stereotypes and the biases that people have that are picking up on all of these kind of fine-tuned distinctions. And one way of thinking about kind of the light-skin disadvantage in terms of kind of the colorism aspect, picking up on what you're saying, is the pressure people feel to be a legitimate and unquestioned, unambiguous member of a category. And when you are not afforded that membership in the category black or even the category white, tension, stress results, right? So again, this is really about why people would feel, I would argue, upset about their accent and all these sorts of things. Because people coming from Nigeria, coming from African countries are going to be categorized a lot of the time simply as black or African American. Well, that means that they are held up to the standards of fitting into this category that they may feel in a lot of different ways they don't really measure up, right, in terms of the accent, facial morphology, et cetera. So there's lots of pressure for them to conform with this category, but they don't necessarily feel accepted in the category all the way.
Thank you for your talk. I'm very fascinated by the question of political blackness. And in particular, I'm thinking about this in two senses. In the one sense, the sort of recent commonly sort of presented frame that particular embodied experiences give you certain political knowledge about how to properly act in the world. And then on the other hand, I'm thinking about this in a sort of South Africa, UK frame in which people of all races are able to claim a blackness for political expedience, for political purposes, right? And I think that your work does something to challenge both of these, and I just want you to speak about that a little bit.
Ooh,
Yeah.
more dangerous territory,
Yeah.
right? You guys want to catch me on film, like dropping all these, like, okay. So I'll shift it a little bit to Brazil, okay? Because one of the things that people are concerned about in the Brazilian case is like who actually counts for their quota system. And you know, one thing that I showed you guys earlier on were cases where people were rejected for phenotypically not appearing black enough, right? Yeah, this case. Okay, now I was interviewed by Veja magazine, which I guess is like the Brazilian equivalent of like Time magazine or something, and they asked me about some of these issues. And one thing that I pointed out that's really complicated here is how do we pull apart intergenerational, to go back to Professor Shelby's point, the intergenerational inequality of having slave legacy and your phenotypical appearance in this particular generation, okay? If you have a system that only focuses on phenotype, this man, phenotypically in this generation, may not appear to be typically black. but he may have slave ancestry. So if he doesn't count for the quotas, then what is the system doing? It's really complicated. Again, it gets back to Brandon's kind of impossible bind thing. Arguably, you could make the case that one form of public policy may undercut the other. It's hard. You have to be able to disentangle what you're really after. Are you thinking intergenerationally or intra-generationally? And you may actually need offsetting policies to deal with these complexities.
Thank you so much for your talk. Sort of bells of recognition were going off as I was listening to you. I've lived in Brazil before. Oh, okay. And so my question is, you talked a little bit about the ideology of racial democracy, right? The idea that, you know, Brazil is just this amalgamation of, you know, one race. I was wondering what role you see patriarchy playing in that. Just to go back to your point about Gilberto Freire, right? Mm-hmm. So his narrative in Casa Grande is that racial slavery and colonization is, in fact, a form of sexual conquest, right?
Yeah.
By Portuguese males of women of color, yep. Right? And it's this foundational moment of sexual conquest that leads to the creation of the Brazilian race, mm-hmm. Right? Sort of mythologically. Right. So, you know, if we go back to that and your questions about, you know, black women, we know that the racialization of black women in Brazil is very different than the racialization of black men in Brazil. Absolutely. Right? And sure. It has all, you know, and baked in is sort of ideas about sexuality, promiscuity, all these things. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that you see the ideology of patriarchy playing in this process of colorism.
Sure. I mean, I think you've identified it right on with sexual violence, racialized sexual violence, right? Certainly one of the major critiques of the masters and the slaves is that he romanticizes the mixture as if this is something that just emerged in Brazil and we should celebrate this, but in fact, it was really sexual violence. And comparatively, we can think about, you know, the question we got before, which was, you know, how is it that some African Americans are light? I wonder, right? Or maybe I don't. Once again, sexual violence, all these sorts of things. So again, thinking about these cases comparatively, you see these similarities, and I think you're absolutely right to highlight the role of patriarchy in the kind of mythology of Brazil. And arguably, even though this is not exactly the same, you can see the kind of mythologization that goes on with how people talk about multiraciality even in the US. Not so much here talking about sexual violence, but rather the idea that once we're all mixed, racism will disappear. And I think the Brazilian case shows very clearly that's not the case at all. Full disclosure, my father-in-law is Brazilian, okay? And one of the things he said was that in Brazil, everyone's blue. There's no race problem here. Dark blue, get to the end of the line. So again, this idea that race mixture solves everything, that you can just be this one mixed race society like Brazil, it ignores, I think, fundamental internal and intra-racial differences in categories in terms of phenotype, and in Brazil, across all the categories.
All right.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
Oh yeah, we're having lunch, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
Good talk.
Yes. Oh, yes, it's huge.